communities where actually we know that they would benefit from taking part in a clinical trial. And also in blood cancer specifically, sometimes the treatment options can be quite limited, and actually the only way that people can get access to some of these advanced therapies is through clinical trials. And so from a patient perspective, having access to those clinical trials is really important, not just for taking part in clinical trials, but but for the benefit they themselves can might get from that treatment. So 18 months or so ago, and this talk is, I suppose, a little bit of how pharma can help us. We were funded by Bristol Myers Squibb. They ran a process for identifying applications that were focused on health inequalities, and we submitted an application looking to understand the barriers to trial participation for specifically patients from the Black and also the Pakistani community in and around London who have higher risk of developing some types of blood cancer and often have poorer outcomes and experiences as well. And then as well as just understanding the barriers, what we wanted to do was say, well, we don't want to just talk about the problems, we want to also understand what the solutions are. So the second phase was how do we develop solutions as well in a co-created way. So I'm very happy to talk more about that about that project, and we can pick on some bits later. But just to say, in the first phase of that project, and I'm sure these will be themes that come out through probably some of the other panelists, we ran a series of workshops. We did interviews with people from the Black and Pakistani community. We also used a community researcher based approach where we actually identified and employed people from those communities to work with us who already have those trusted relationships with those communities. And they were the ones who went out and did the interviews. They were the people who brought together the participants. And that was a really powerful approach for us. And we engaged over kind of 40 different people, but also we engaged with the healthcare professionals. So I think the other thing to say is this isn't an us versus them situation. It's about how do we work together, both from a patient perspective, but also the healthcare professionals that we work with. And some of the issues that we identified were really around lack of trust, which can be compounded by really lack of time. So how do when in a 15-minute conversation where you're having a discussion about your cancer, there's often not the time to have a discussion about clinical trials or for people to feel safe enough to answer those questions, ask those questions around what does clinical trials mean. Often it can feel culturally quite disjointed from healthcare professionals who might not have that training around cultural competencies when having conversations with people. The other area was around information and the need for information to be tailored. And yes, translation is a big issue where actually if something isn't presented in English and it gets translated, you can lose the medical nuance. But actually, how do you give information to people in a way that isn't just lots of written literature? How people take in information can be quite different. And then the third area was around representation and people not seeing people who look like them either on clinical trials or talking to them about clinical trials. And linked into that was actually what does clinical being on a clinical trial look like for me? What does it mean for me? What are the benefits for me? How do I take part in a clinical trial and manage this alongside my life? How my family going to be impacted? So that's the barriers, and I'll talk about the solutions later.
Thank you so much, Rubina. Definitely lots of things that we have often heard about, but lots of new insights, and I can't wait to hear more. Over to Christiana.
Hi, am I unmuted? I hope so. Yes. So my name is Christiana Dinah. I am a consultant ophthalmologist at London Northwest Trust in Northwest London, and also the Director of Research and Innovation there. I guess it's really important to give you the context of where I work. Northwest London, which is a very one of the most ethnically diverse areas and socioeconomically diverse areas in the UK. And specifically as an ophthalmologist, I'm impacted by the fact that we have one of the highest rates of diabetes in the UK. And this is because diabetic retinopathy is one of the leading causes of sight loss, remains a leading cause of sight loss, and it disproportionately affects the patients in my community who are 2 to 3 times likely to have severe diabetic retinopathy and to lose sight from diabetic retinopathy. Unfortunately, they are also significantly underrepresented in the clinical trials. So over the last 8 years, we have taken time to actually try and understand this, and we've built significant relationships across industry, particularly with industry working on this particular therapeutic area. But what we started with first was actually understanding our community. So we set up a patient forum. So our patients outside of this clinic, because you've got 5, 10 minutes maybe in a clinic appointment, that's not really the time to sort of say, oh, so why are you not in a clinical trial, even if we were to get the clinical trial. So we set up separate forums where patients could attend free, and it would be in our lecture theatre. And it was basically around the service. How can we improve the service and so on? And within that, we asked about clinical trials. And we were, significantly impacted by what they shared with us, trust as some of the issues, not even understanding what a clinical trial means for them. Words like, consent form, participant information sheet. What do I need to know to be able to genuinely say yes? Who's looking, who's regulating it, and so on. And that's more so for commercial trials. But I think that what that did was enable us to actually understand that in our community, despite all of these concerns, 70 to 80% of our patients said that access to innovative trials remains their key, not trials, therapies, remains the key ask they want from their local community. So we identified that gap. Our patients want access to innovative therapies that stop them from losing sight and so on. But there is a gap with going into trials because we're not doing enough to try to make it possible for them. So based on that, we as investigators started looking at our trials with a different eye now, with a critical eye, and started to identify some of the reasons why our patients are systematically excluded, which included things like vague eligibility criteria, like patients with many diseases. What does that mean? So then you can pretty much exclude most people, or specific to diabetes, a particular benchmark, so 10% HbA1c, when most of our patients are closer to 12. So in engaging with industry, we were able to say, refining those eligibility criteria will open this up more to our patients. And then once we were able to attract trials to our sites, we were able to set up a patient engagement group specific to diabetic retinopathy, who would review patient-facing materials from industry and feedback on what works, what doesn't work, how to present the data, both using visual stimuli, but even summaries and so on. We found, using a specific example with a particular company that came to us, our patients not only reviewed the patient facing material, but also reviewed the schedule of activities, and were able to streamline the number of visits from 11 to 8, and also feedback things like, some of these visits can happen closer to home, but culturally, some of our patients said they wouldn't want a stranger in their home. So they would prefer that to be at the GP practice. So those were some of the feedbacks that we got. And that particular study won a commendation from the company, as well as from the REC group. So those are some of the ways, some of the examples in which we've been able to collaborate with industry to improve access to trials for diverse patients. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christiana. Really, really interesting insights, especially the ability to make that patient group and the streamlining. That's just brilliant. Um, Really impactful for future opportunities for the community. Um, and just going to go to Pauline now. Introduce yourself and your overview of the case study.
That's great. Thank you so much, Pavan. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. Hi, everyone. My name is Pauline Namaganda. I'm a clinical operations lead at Roche. So I'm really involved in study delivery in the UK, so managing our clinical trials. We work quite closely with the NHS and other organisations to bring trials to our UK patients or participants. I'm currently working in the Alzheimer's disease area, and I have a particular interest in how we can better support inclusion of diverse participants in studies in general, and also a real interest in how we can influence change within industry and amongst other stakeholders as well. So kind of making it broader beyond just Roche, but how can we really make a difference? So I'd like to talk to you today about one of the case studies, so an initiative that we trialing at Roche at the moment. So this is an ongoing piece of work. and the aim is to really try to increase participation of South Asian communities in our dementia clinical trials in the UK. Why does this matter? So we know that there's a rising burden within this community of dementia and Alzheimer's disease specifically, yet participants remain underrepresented in clinical trials. So we'd like to see what we can do to really support that and change that. So the primary goal of this particular initiative was to look at how we can develop strategies for recruitment and retaining South Asian participants and their study partners. Of course, with dementia trials, we've got the element of considering that the participants will need some support as part of the studies. And then secondary to that, we'd really like to develop culturally sensitive recommendations for engaging individuals with memory and cognitive issues, and just to share these across UK trials. So what have we done so far within this initiative? So in May this year, we had our first workshop in Wolverhampton, where nearly 30 members of the South Asian community, it was actually linked to an already existing women's group. So we met together with the group and some additional members. It wasn't just women, we had a few men attend. And so the sessions were actually led by an external consultant and an investigator working on our studies. And so they've both got experience and expertise in working within the South Asian communities on dementia awareness in general. So in this session, really focused on educating participants on dementia and recognizing symptoms. And then we subsequently had an open discussion within the group about identifying barriers to trial participation, getting information directly from the community, gathering suggestions and how we can improve. So the next steps for this will be to looking at a second workshop similar to the first in the Burton area to look at to work with a different South Asian group, recognizing the differences, within that and the challenges within obviously grouping one, certain people within one specific sector. And then subsequently we'll be organizing smaller focus groups, hopefully with interested people from these workshops that we would have already conducted, and just get them to really think about trial participation in more detail and how we can generally support the community in trial awareness and involvement. And our vision really for this work is to replicate this model more broadly and expand it nationwide, and maybe not just within the South Asian community, but look at other communities that are underrepresented in trials. So,
Thank you so much, Pauline. Yeah, I think it's so important that we make things that are replicable across disease areas and populations, and that just makes inclusion a lot more sustainable. Yeah, over to Judith.
Hello, everybody.
Would you like to introduce yourself and share your case study? Thank you.
Yeah, hello. Thank you for having me. My name is Judith Neptial, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of From Me to You, The Art of Survival. And we are a grassroots organisation that support people when they receive, people from marginalised communities when they've received a cancer diagnosis. If I go back in order to go forward, the reason we were established was because in 2018, I was diagnosed with terminal cancer and given under a year to live. Consequently, after establishing a way to live, to continue to live, I found that I came across many barriers throughout my journey within healthcare. And we really wanted to see if other people had experienced some of the things that had happened to myself. So we set up a Facebook group in around about 2019. By 2020, we had formed an organisation because of the growth was phenomenal. And what we found really surprising, well, it wasn't actually quite surprising. What we found out was what we already knew, that the same themes were being spoken of again and again. And that was an idea of not being seen, not being heard, and feeling very uncomfortable in their interactions with the healthcare service and general mistrust. One of the main themes, however, that came out of this at the time was accessibility. So, as a consequence of that, we initially started up with support groups for the community because we believe that this is a community-based issue. We have a community group, we now have a men's group, a women's group, and a nutritional growth group. And our growth has considered to increase at a very rapid rate. In relation to some of the issues that we came across, one of the first things we felt that we needed to target was accessibility and the issues surrounding that. And what we found as an organisation was that that was done through educational training. So we set about completing empowerment training for our community, which looked at various things that we've spoken about: language, mistrust, the whole dynamic of power and privilege within the room when people from marginalised communities step into a room with a medical professional, and what that then does to the other party and the implications of those conversations. And the whole surface around that was to actually empower the patient to feel more confident in actually vocalising what their needs were. That has proved extremely successful. We are now actually partnering with Macmillan and another pharmaceutical company. I won't say their names because it's a slight conflict, in having our empowerment training run through St Bartholomew's Hospital. I believe it's soon to start. So we're incredibly proud of that. I think one of the other areas that we also looked at, because we believe that this is a two-pronged approach, and we can't look at one side without looking at the other. And that was that we looked at cultural competency training for healthcare clinicians, because we believe that you cannot empower a community to go back into a system that currently does not work for them without looking at the reasons for that and trying to actually empower health clinicians in the same way that we are empowering the community, in the hope that we meet in the middle.
Judith, I
Yeah.
just wanted to reflect on that. Something you just said, it really struck, was very, it stood out for me. Just you can't expect a community to sort of go back into the system where there has already been issue of mistrust or exploitative practices, and there is such a need for that training so that, although you're educating the community, we need to know that they're also going to be well received when they are going to go back into that space where trust was lost.
Absolutely. And I think one of the main issues as well, unfortunately, as a grassroots organisation that we found is that as a minority grassroots organisation, that some of the scepticisms that we've received from larger institutions in trying to move forward with some of our projects have been the very same issues that have affected our community in
Absolutely.
grassroots scenarios.
Yeah,
And
and these are
actually, we also
sorry.
need to look at that. But thank you.
No, thank you so much. No, I was just saying these are challenges and barriers that we often see coming up in across communities, across different work, right? Talking about mistrust and talking about essentially being uncomfortable in the whole system, experiencing discrimination in implicit and explicit ways. And I would love to hear everybody's thoughts on all of these. And I just wanted to go to Rubina. How was your experience of engaging patients and people from the Black and the Pakistani communities? And what were the key, maybe a success factor, did you think, or how did you overcome this barrier, something that came out of that work?
Yeah, and I think the first thing to say as a bigger organization, we don't have those trusted relationships in the same way that colleagues from grassroots communities do. We're not reaching those communities, so it's really hard for us. And so the initial learning was that actually we had to spend a lot of time in trying to identify and find people who would engage with us, and that took us longer than we had originally planned. But also the use of community researchers and people in those communities was a really powerful approach for us. But we had to try lots of different ways of engagement. It's not just a survey out and a response back. Also, we wanted to have in-depth and kind of really values-led kind of conversations with people. And so people have to be willing to kind of meet you in that space. So we tried a lot of different approaches to get that insight. And actually, and what was really powerful was we knew that as soon as we had a couple of really strong community champions and advocates, it was much easier to reach, to increase our reach. And it worked really well actually with the Black community, where we had some really strong champions in that space. And it took us longer with the Pakistani community to do that. And we had to take approaches where we were meeting people in their spaces. But the insight, that we were gathering was so powerful for us. And actually coming back to, some of the things that we've been saying about cultural competency, some of the things that we were hearing from some of our Black community was actually they found it difficult to self-advocate because there's a perception of being aggressive, and actually, and in that situation, they didn't want to come across as being kind of challenging, because that's the kind of stereotypical kind of images. And in that, and actually what that does is then people retreat, and they're not then willing to kind of self-advocate or ask the questions. And so I think it was really, and then, so I think it's really important to then come back to the point you say in terms of how the healthcare professionals receive that information back when people are advocating. That importance of cultural competency training is really important. And then coming on to some of the solutions that we kind of identified, I suppose really that idea of community champions, and how do we use that more powerfully. And I think there's two things for me, and coming back to kind of the idea of partnerships, as a single organization, as brilliant as it was for us to have kind of 10 community champions working in and around London, we cannot afford to have 3,000 community champions doing that. So scalability is a really important factor. And I think there's two areas for us: is where do we work in partnerships with some of the bigger organizations? So I'm trying to speak to people about kind of blood cancer, but there'll be prostate cancer, and there'll be diabetes, and there'll be cardiovascular health, and all of those organizations are trying to reach the same people, and we're all trying to engage with them and get their input, but we're probably trying to do it as 5 different organizations. So is there something as bigger charities, how do we work together in a disease agnostic way that is much more community focused, and how do we get kind of our insight, in a joined up way? And secondly, when it comes to community champions, where is the grassroots organizations who already have those trusted relationships, and how can we work in partnership with them? And I think as bigger charities, sometimes people can go, you can undervalue the effort that it takes for some of those smaller charities, the costs that's involved, the time that's involved in doing that and building those relationships. So I think we have to be much more willing to meet those charities in a place where actually maybe we put in joint applications for funding, or maybe we fund you for doing a bit of work for us, and really having kind of really shifting those power dynamics in terms of bigger organizations and smaller organizations, and how we kind of co-create together. The other areas that kind of came out for us
Sorry,
was,
I just wanted to
oh yeah.
take your point on the community researchers and community
Mhm,
champions. I think that's
mhm,
so important, because I think it sort of ties into a few things that everybody's mentioned about seeing, people seeing themselves in these sort of in the staff or within the health system, and being more comfortable, and sort of automatically being open to having a better dialogue and having a more engaging dialogue. And I just wanted to ask Pauline and Christiana, your thoughts. What do you think, Pauline, first, if from a trial perspective, how do you see these community champions being embedded in terms of if we're talking about a code like designing of protocols, or we're talking about delivery of recruitment for trials? Would love to get your thoughts.
Thank
Can I
you.
jump in if nobody else wants to? I believe Macmillan have, sorry.
Oh,
I
sorry.
think just, yeah, Pauline was just,
Yeah,
but yeah,
sure.
we can just
Yeah,
come across from
I'll go
Pauline to
quickly and
Christiana.
then
Yeah.
bring Christiana in maybe. So I think from our perspective, this is feedback that we've been hearing for such a long time, and we're really trying to navigate that space. With regards to community champions, I know this is something that's been implemented in many places, across the UK. And kind of, I think for us, one of the things that has come up, specifically thinking about, if I speak about the dementia trials or Alzheimer's disease trials specifically, is we've got this language conversation and the language barriers and how we can overcome that. And something that has come out quite clearly for us is that, yes, we can provide materials in different languages, but actually sometimes people need somebody to talk to. So it's understanding how we can, yes, we can provide materials and make sure that part is covered, but actually it's that personal relationship in many cases that comes ahead of just giving documents to patients to read and try to understand. And tied in with that, a lot of the feedback that we got was around, of course, the family's involvement in that process.
Yeah.
And for the communities that we have so far worked with, it's really critical for us to understand that actually in many cases, so thinking specifically about dementia, we're talking about older adults, but for as long as their families are not on board, we are never going to get them onto our trials. And it's understanding how to support those conversations and those discussions. And I think this is where the community champions come in. Thinking specifically about the work that we've done, it was a diverse group. We had healthcare professionals, we had retired healthcare professionals within that group. So we're trying to understand how we can capitalize on some of that, even if it's just knowledge, gathering the knowledge and information so that we can understand, they have worked with these patients. So, we do the research, but they've worked with the patients, they understand what the patients need, and having that connect to the community, they have a better understanding of what that might look like for those communities. So how can we work alongside? That's why we have a key focus certainly at Roche with co-production. A lot of the work that we do, we're trying to get the relevant people involved, trying to pull them into the conversations so that we're not making a decision and asking them to review our materials, but actually, can we make that decision together? It becomes a little bit more complicated when I'm designing a clinical study protocol because of challenges with the regulatory requirements and certain standardized tests that we have to use. However, it's something that we're considering right now, and we do think about that right at the beginning of the study. I know with some of our studies, investigators have the opportunity to have a look at the study protocol in advance, so they can give us some feedback about potential areas that we can revise and may not be so critical with regards to the regulatory aspects, and would make a huge difference to participation within the study. So it's really a multi-pronged approach, but there's a real key focus in involving families and having community champions that actually can connect with the patients we're trying to reach, and they understand what the challenges are for those patients and how to support them in overcoming some of those.
Thanks.
I
Thanks,
think,
Pauline. I wanted to
yeah,
bring
I think
Christiana.
Pauline is absolutely correct. The feedback I've gotten from our patients, or we've gotten in our community, has been we don't want to be researchers who parachute in when we've got a study, we need to recruit. So that's suddenly we're your friend. How are you? Where are you? And then when that study is gone, we parachute out. We want to set and establish sustained collaborations. And oftentimes there are communities already who have, or organizations already who have established those sustained collaborations. An example in Northwest London that we discovered are, I think they're called Community Health Watch, but basically these are community officers who actually are, their charity supports patients, underserved groups across the community, totally disease agnostic, and have relationships with these communities many times, invited into their homes, know their families, all of that stuff. So, you working with them is really important. Now, the caveat there is that we thought we had identified the secret key, and it's working through these community officers. But then, and then we approached them and said, look, there's this funding from the NIHR looking at inclusion, apply for it. It had to be a community-led application. We'll support you. And they were obviously overwhelmed because they hadn't done that before. So again, it's important, even when we're working with communities, that there's a knowledge transfer, there is support, and that we don't overwhelm. As researchers, we do grants for a living. So, asking someone to do a grant is like, yeah, please just, but actually, walking hand in hand with them to support them to do this is really important, and not assuming that those skills are just there, because oftentimes they're not. And then lastly, on the point of families, that's so important. Most patients I approach in my clinic about a trial will say, I normally say, obviously, you have to take it home, have a think, and they say, yes, and I'll give it to my auntie, my uncle, my dad, before they. So actually, we decided that we also need to take our trials to the families. So we created videos and stuff for schools, because oftentimes they go home, they ask their secondary school age kid who will read it. But if they don't know about trials and they can't, how can they really sort of inform? So we created sort of tools to help secondary school age children to be able to critically look at a consent form, at a PIS, a participation information sheet, and even why is the research even important in this particular disease area, so that hopefully they can better support their family members. So I agree, it's multi-pronged. There's at least 4 buckets, the family, the community officers that are there, researchers being culturally competent, industry realizing that this isn't just a moral DEI thing, it's actually, there's a scientific merit to it. But all of those things together support better inclusive trials.
Thank you so much, Christiana. I think that's really summed up so many of these points we've been talking about. And just on the skills, how do we empower communities and really bring not just the patient, but them as people and them as communities into the realm of science and trials and research. And Judith, I just wanted to ask you, when it comes to how do we really impart that skill to, lay members of the community, to patients? What are your thoughts on it? What advice would you give as someone
One of the
not
things,
only, yeah.
yeah, absolutely. One of the things I did want to address is that obviously the most important thing that we seem to all know is who delivers the message to the community. That's of the utmost important. The second thing I'd like to address is when we say community champions, I believe that Macmillan worked quite tirelessly in a project with community champions, and the feedback wasn't that great from that. What I really do think, although I do understand the whole concept of that, what I also think is that when we talk about community champions, unless we're talking about community organisations, they don't have the sustainability to support families in the way that they need, which also when you're asking families to engage in clinical trials, into, different medical frameworks that they haven't before, there definitely needs to be advocacy alongside that. So I think that we really need to be empowering organisations who run alongside, as well as empowering, educating and training, that they also advocate for the patient from the beginning of the diagnosis right through to the end. We found that as an organisation to be invaluable, and also consistently built trust, which then was reverberated back into the community. And another thing that I think we ought to look at is when we say community champions, there needs to be looked at that communities now, we've been telling our stories for a long time. However, we have not been involved in the very process and outcomes. There's no sharing of power. And that really has to be looked at. And again, that's why I would reaffirm that we should be looking at community-based organisations and looking at how we upskill them, how we include them in that whole process, and actually share within the power within that dynamic, to actually be involved at the very beginning of what that research looks like, and actually to the very end of how it outcomes, because then communities not only see themselves reflected in the process, there's a real feeling of trust that they can and that they've been engaged in that process, and it's something that they can actually fully engage with. Sorry, I'm quite
Yeah,
passionate
no,
about
thank you. I think I love what you said about really sharing the power, because I think that's how you ensure that everybody is not only at the table, but everybody is contributing effectively and meaningfully. And people have people are empowered through either education or through tools. Christiana, I love the toolkit for the secondary school kids to be able to reflect on how to critically look at a trial. How do if a kid is being asked to decipher something out for their parent, how do they do that effectively? So I really love that. And I just wanted to really hone in on just like one quick fire thing from all four of you. Why do you think, if you had to say in one sentence, why do you think inclusive clinical trials matter for your sector? Just one sentence. Let's go with let's whoever wants to go
I'll
first.
go first.
Yeah.
I think it's important because I want to be able to look after every single patient that walks through my door. I don't want to cherry pick. I want to be able to say, I have an understanding of how this therapy will affect you or will benefit you because there is evidence underpinning it.
Thank you. Fab, who'd like to go next?
Um, I'd like to firstly say, I know it doesn't necessarily sound like that, but I am the biggest advocate for clinical trials. I'm currently living proof of why clinical trials work. I am on a clinical trial. But what I find devastating is that 5 of my family have died because they did not have access to clinical trials. And so I would implore the companies or organisations that are listening today, please work with grassroots organisations and help us to help you to empower our community. It really is a matter of life and death.
Thank you so much, Judith. Thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, we really need to ask for better engagement with community organizations and ask and demand the industry and the organizations that are doing these trials to better engage communities. Pauline, I see you're unmuted.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm happy to second, and really, I think my response is quite aligned with Christiana's. As a researcher, thinking about, industry, we're looking to get generalizable data results just to make sure that our interventions are actually effective for the whole population. And we can't do that without inclusion in our trials, apart from, the morality of making sure everyone has access to, to these medicines as early as possible. It's just making sure that the data is applicable for the whole population.
And for me, I suppose it's because it's the right thing to do, and why would we go ahead with kind of continuing to develop treatments that don't and offering kind of interventions that don't work for everybody? And, scientifically, from a company perspective, from an economic perspective, the treatments that are being developed, they need to be working for the majority of people, and you can only do that if the people are included in the clinical trials, but also. I just think many of us are impacted by conditions, and we can all understand the benefits of taking part in clinical trials. And we've just got a duty to make sure that people in our community also understand and engage with that as well, so that they can benefit.
Thank you so much, Rubina. And yeah, we really want this to be not an end, but more of a starting point for everybody who's on this call, to really take this as a starting point to discuss this within their teams, to discuss this within their projects, really looking at how within the organization, how do we make clinical trials more inclusive and effective. Like we all agree, making trials more inclusive and effective is it's not about being woke, or it is about making sure that we have scientific rigor, we have data that represents everybody from our populations, and ensuring that our research is safe and effective for every single person, and really ensuring that equity of access, that equity of health and care. Like Judith said, lots of people that are out there would love to be involved, And I think it's really about time we start doing those engagements. We have about four minutes left. Wanted to open for any thoughts, any last comments from our panelists.
Can I just add one more point?
Absolutely.
To Judith's point, she's absolutely right about how this can be life or death, or in my case, sight or blindness, really. I remember when the anti-VEGF injections were introduced, in the 2000s. And back then, if you're very short-sighted, and you grew an abnormal blood vessel at the back of the eye, which is a risk of being very short-sighted, you would lose vision because we didn't have any treatment for it. And then we had a clinical trial for the new treatments, and the sponsor said we could only recruit 10, I believe. And mind you, like as I said, if you didn't have the treatment, you lost sight really within weeks. So patients who I've never seen people beg to be in a trial. Literally, we would treat them within 4 weeks, 6 weeks, vision improved. And as soon as we hit 10, everyone else who came along, we had to say, no, sorry, we can't recruit. And they lost sight. And that was shocking because I don't think I had appreciated trials as being a form of care. And it, of course, is a form of care in cancer, in sometimes in sight and in other areas. So I think there is clinical trials for improving care. Today's standard of trial is tomorrow's standard of care. But there's also when sometimes even today, it is your only opportunity for treatment. So then having a scenario where some people are systematically excluded from that access just shows the unfairness of it. In addition to the scientific rigor and the need for robustness and generalizability, that unfairness, that moral argument remains valid and remains strong.
Absolutely, and that almost eats away at you from the point of researcher, from the point of practitioner. It also ties into what Rubina said about even specific types of blood cancer. The only way to get an access is through being part of clinical trials, is through being part of a novel treatment that's being developed. And how do we ensure that we do not exclude right from the very beginning? How do we design studies in a way that systematically do not exclude? It could be inclusive like criteria, it could be certain kinds of education and training. And I think there's so much here that we have learned from all four of you. So I wanted to really thank you all so much for being a part of the panel. And yeah, just brilliant insights from all of you, from the work that you've done, from the work that you've seen, from all of your own experiences. And we really want to ensure that everybody in the audience is really taking away something actionable from today. So please do reflect on what we've spoken on, lots of insights on certain buckets of training and engagement of people through patient forums, through research champions, and really investing in small scale organizations. So once again, thank you all so much. And we're very happy that you were involved. Have a lovely day ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Bye.